And now I'm going to introduce Chris Gray. Chris is former Managing Director at Accenture. He is Chief of Public Sector now at Digital. He's Chair of BITC's Northwest Regional Leadership Board. He's the Prince of Wales's Ambassador for Responsible Business. So you've got quite a good set of things going on there, Chris. Would you just like to introduce yourself, and then we'll go into the questions, all the things I've missed there.
Yeah, no worries, Claire, and really pleased, and thank you for setting up the conversation this morning. Really looking forward to it. As you say, I sort of have a day job, which is Chief of Public Sector at Digital. So that's a fast-growing, probably about 5-year-old digital business, professional services business. And I joined them this year, literally almost with a blank sheet of paper, to build a public service practice over the coming years. As you say, before that, I was for many years at Accenture, again, working almost exclusively in our public sector practice. Outside of that, as you say, for the last 2 years now, I've been chair of business in the community in the Northwest, and we've got a board of over about 40 companies, large and medium, I'd say, sized businesses who get together and try and drive the responsible business agenda in the Northwest. And with that comes the snappy title of Responsible Business Ambassador. I also am involved with a multi-academy trust, Prospere Trust in South Manchester. So sit on their members board, and they're really interesting. They've got a mix of different schools, including some special schools. So it's one of the few special schools in that part of Manchester. And then I think last but not least, I also work with University of Liverpool. I didn't go there, but for the last sort of 3 years or so have sat on their advisory board for the management school. So hopefully bringing some perspectives to that as well.
Thank you. And we're speaking to you in Croatia. So thanks for leaving the pool so that we're not all completely jealous.
No worries.
Obviously got a nice life.
With my hair colour, I don't really do sun, but it's nice to get a week away and some warmer weather. But yeah, I'll escape the pool to join you this morning.
So obviously you're having a nice time at the moment, but can you kick off by telling us about your childhood, where you've come from, all of that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so I guess I've never ventured further from the north, and my northern roots are quite strong, but I've made the transition from the northeast to the northwest over the last 20 years or so. So literally born and grew up in Northumberland, so a market town about 20 miles north of Newcastle, and that's where my parents still live, and is a really great part of the country to get back to. I haven't been for probably a while, but it's a lovely place to sort of grow up, and almost quite idyllic in terms of being close to countryside, close to beaches, close to sea, etc., and a fairly comfortable, I would say, market town. There's lots of challenging areas in the northeast, but I would say I was quite fortunate to do that. I'm an only child, and grew up with parents who both worked actually in their own way in public sector, and it's strange that that's sort of where I have ended up, whilst very much in digital and technology and professional careers. It's sort of where I've gravitated to. So my mum was a nurse, and then a sort of clinical nurse specialist, so that was her track. And of course, alongside the nurse there, my father was in the police force, and both of them really, that's where they drove all of their careers, right from sort of leaving school right the way through. So I guess a strong, in some ways, public sector and public service ethos that I've sort of picked up. That said, I guess I've always been interested in the sort of the wider world, and particularly even now, one of the strange points at Digital is we all have a second title which tries to give us a bit of an insight as to what we do outside of work, and mine is linguist. And I guess I've always been interested in attempting to learn languages, and as I sort of grew through my school time, did a mix of A-levels, which included studying French, and then at the age of 18 I went off down to Birmingham to Aston University to study international business and modern languages. And for me, the language point was really important. It sort of brought that international aspect really to life. But language was, for me, is all about communication. It's not really about, reading poetry in French or long novels. It's always been about connecting with people and understanding people. And had really, 4 great years at university, which included a year studying at business school over in France, which again was sort of as close to the Alps as it probably could be. So it was a very nice time of studying in the morning and then skiing, if I could do, in the afternoon. So that was sort of university years. And I guess through that time, I was really sort of looking at what I wanted out of a job, and true to form, this thing called consulting, which, if I'm honest, I knew nothing really about. It seemed quite exciting, quite glamorous, and also involved, I think, a lot of travel and moving around and sort of getting to see new places and new people, which was something that continues to interest me. And I guess did, as you did back then, lots of milk rounds and read all of the brochures. It was in the days before internet, etc., and filled out lots of application forms, and joined in 1995 what was Anderson Consulting. And true to form, I guess, having been promised this life of international jet setting, I was sent back to Newcastle to a major project that we had won, and spent really, I guess, the first 2-3 years working on that particular project, which was in the public sector. It was a big replacement for the national insurance system that took many, many years to complete. But throughout my career, I guess, sort of with Accenture, that's sort of where I stayed and continued to grow. So that's probably a bit more than my childhood, Claire. But
how did your gay narrative sort of weave its way through this young life and early career?
Yeah, I guess like most people, right? By the time you're sort of I don't know, approaching puberty, and probably before, you sort of think, oh, hang on a second, there's something a bit different here. And that starts to perhaps come out. I guess I was, it was reflecting upon it, the 80s were probably a challenging time to be coming of age, recognizing you're gay, with, tombstone leaflets falling through your door as the AIDS crisis hit, when there was still no equal age of consent, and right. So there was that sort of strange feelings, and I guess to a certain extent I probably very unsuccessfully, but perhaps to myself, tried to hide, if I'm honest, my true self, and I guess I was conscious as well, overly so, of being an only child and suddenly thinking, oh my god, if I'm if I'm gay, well, what happens, right? What will my parents, how will they react? What will it mean for them if their only son is gay? So I sort of, I guess I started to come to terms with myself probably when I was approaching, more in terms of the sort of sixth form. But to a certain extent, I guess I tried to put on that coat of, that sort of, and hide it to a certain extent and put that first. And to a certain extent, whilst that came off at university a bit, I guess I was still, there's probably that balance. And it was hard, I think, in terms of, you talked about role models at the start. I think looking back then, there was a certain way that you perhaps expected people to be, the people who were gay in the media, or who were coming out with sort of a certain stereotype. And if you didn't quite fit that, or you didn't see the professional business people or people in technology or other areas who were out, I think it was difficult, because you sort of went, is that what I need to conform to? Or if I don't conform to that, well, who are my role models? So yeah, it was interesting. I think the last conversation that you had was with Tim from ATK, and it was sort of, I felt like, oh, was I really, as out and as proud as I could have been? Probably not, but then I think it worked for me. And looking back now, one of the things that I guess I try and do now as a leader, and absolutely an out and proud leader, is sort of try and be that role model for others who particularly are entering work for the first time. Because even if I got comfortable, perhaps with myself at university, joining a big partnership as it was back then, and in that corporate world, there was a certain amount of almost, feeling like, actually, I have to go back into the closet and fit back in again, because the 90s again were a time when the sort of ERG and the support networks that people have now, and the groups that exist in an awful lot of businesses, didn't exist. And therefore, actually, that was probably in 2000s when we got our first LGBT network that was established, and you started to realize that you weren't alone. So I'd say, probably gainers throughout, but probably I'd say kept in check, perhaps, rightly or wrongly, as we went through that.
Yeah. So you joined Accenture. We got the first bit of the story, and then the sort of second bit. At what point did you decide, I'm going to be out at work? And have you got any good stories about anything like that?
Yeah, I think there's probably a bad story, but then there's some good stories afterwards. I think, I come back to it, and I was reflecting on it, and it's something that marked me very much at the time when I had met somebody I cared about deeply. I was in a relationship that was a sort of a longer term thing, and actually Tony's now my husband, so 20 odd years later, we're still together. And he had moved from Spain, and we were living together, but I was still probably not out to some of my immediate bosses. And they were actually at the point of making a fairly big promotion step for me at the time. And it was also the time of the debates around actually equalising the age of consent. And I happened to be working for somebody at the time who I would say was a sort of, if you could sort of say, very much sort of old school, probably is the best word to describe them. Very strong sort of, and didn't hide his Catholic religion around it at all. But I remember sitting in his office as we were almost talking about my promotion papers, and flinging down the Daily Telegraph and going bloody nonsense as he sort of, the front page was sort of talking about equal age of consent. And at that moment, I was like, shit, I'm never going to, pardon my French, I'm not going to get promoted. Right? I absolutely have to hide. If he is the person that's signing my forms off, he is the person whose yes or no will decide whether I'm promoted or not. I can't say anything. And when I had been sort of warming up to coming out, that probably set me back quite a way, if I'm brutally honest. And I think is just a really interesting point as leaders. It's those small gestures, it's those small things that we can say that actually can really impact those around us. That said, I think when I had got through that promotion point, it was probably about 8 months later. And I was, again, it was coming up to sort of the Christmas party season, etc. And I was chatting away, and I was chatting to somebody different I was working to at that time. And they were like, oh, so, you're bringing somebody to the Christmas party, etc., etc. And I was being quite effusive about it. And he turned, he goes, no, you can bring your boyfriend with you. That's fine. And at that moment, I go, you sort of stop and you go, who told you? How had you been found out? And of course, word gets around. But that was probably my first, I'd say, ally. Somebody in a senior position who said, no, it's fine. You don't have to hide. You don't have to be that way. But it was one of those heart-stopping moments, I think, when you sort of think, oh, they know. And then once you know that, then I think there's no holding back. And I've been blessed, I guess, through my career of also having people work for me who I'd say are quite good gossips, and therefore they've probably often before I've met people, I've already come out to them in one way or another. So that's been very good.
I think we've all had those heart-stopping moments, and we absolutely love it, really, when we get outed. Although it's kind of not the done thing to go around outing people. You're actually quite glad when it's done for you, because the act of coming out is a bit of a barrier sometimes still, isn't it?
I think so. And I think, anybody who works in, professional services firms or who's interacting with different customers, different clients. It's not the most important. You know, you're there for doing a job, right? On day one, you're there to talk to people about other things. But it is those moments when you're meeting a new client and, you know, you're chatting about where you went on holiday, and they're like, oh, did you go with the family? Oh, you're not going on school holiday, so you don't have kids, or whatever it is. And then, of course, you feel like, right, okay, here we go again. You know, and I think that's the point that, yeah, coming out is not a one-off event for any of us, and it's a lifetime of mini comings out to various people along the way, and yeah, it gets easier, but then there's always that point of, all right, here we go again. You know, I have to gauge you and the situation before I can find the right way to say it.
Interesting question, actually. Maybe it's something we could all discuss about breakouts, but is there a way to mitigate this we could all recommend to each other? One of my favourite things is to have a little rainbow flag on my Twitter. Not that everyone's stalking me on Twitter, but I also quite early in a conversation drop in, I was speaking to my wife yesterday, and it just diffuses that need to come out. But that's just my method, and I'm not sure if it's that effective. But I don't know, for me, the most awkward thing is that moment where someone says, what does your fella think about that? What does your husband think? And you have to go, oh, and then they're embarrassed and you're embarrassed. And
yeah,
anyway.
And yeah, I think we'll talk about that in the breakout session. That'd be good.
Yeah, that would be quite good. So obviously we've seen a lot of shift. We've talked about the 80s and 90s. We've seen a lot of shift in favour of sort of LGBT people. What do you think is still missing? What do you think we still need to do?
I think there's a couple of observations. I guess one, I would say, you know, we look at it, and often perhaps on this call as well, we look at it through a very much a sort of Western European lens, I would say. It's really interesting as you sort of move around. I was really fortunate, probably about 10 years ago now, I spent about 2 years living and working in Mexico City. And at that time, I went absolutely from day one. I thought, right, I'm going very much as an out and proud gay, you know, partner in the managing director in our practice to go over there and to work with the teams out there. And you land, and there was a very nascent LGBT network. And you sort of realize it's like stepping back in time. It was literally probably, you know, where the UK had been 10 years beforehand. Some of those attitudes that perhaps I had suffered as the manager, the one that I spoke about, that was probably happening to people at the same level as I was 10 years later. So, you know, I think that was really important for me to go to Mexico and demonstrate that there were, you know, gay leaders in the organization, and to sort of put my arm around the team there and give them a bit of support and a bit of guidance and allyship as they started to grow. So I think, you know, that's probably one thing that we look at, and you don't have to go very far, right? You look at parts of probably Eastern Europe, or probably around the Balkans, right, where I'm sat right now today, and you sort of look at LGBT rights and think, actually, we still across the world have a huge way to go. And I suppose there is that point of allyship from countries that are more advanced to start to look after and see what we can do to support others. I think the second thing is the debate has continued to evolve, and I think you talked a bit around you know, your future speaker Hannah coming up. I think if we start to look at issues such as trans rights and sort of the different types of sexuality that are now coming to the fore, that people are now celebrating, I think we've just got, you know, this, whether it's just understanding those, I think there's an awful lot I certainly need to do, and probably we as a community need to do in terms of learning. But then I just think, you know, there is a point, and I think the thing I would always say about inclusion and everything to do with, you're never done, right? It's not an exercise to sit there and go, right, we've ticked the box, that's it, we've done, we can stop. You know, my sense is that it's an ongoing point, it's an ongoing struggle, because once you put one set of policies in place, there will be other ones that come up that you need to do, or once you've looked at one group, then there's another group. So there's be a couple of thoughts
on that. Then, you know, we've got all of these companies now having policies in place are, you know, that's kind of standard, isn't it? How do we shift business to make it actually inclusive? How do we get it just from, you know, from the paper and into real life?
I think a huge amount of it would be, in my mind, is around either visible leadership or allyship. I think that's the key point, is around stories. You know, you can have all of the, as you say, all of the paper or the policies in the world, but actually it's how people act in the business. It's what people learn is the right way to act. And that comes back by having leaders who are educated, leaders who are diverse, leaders who bring different opinion. And I think that's where we just need to continue to evolve and really making sure that we're looking at the whole picture. You know, there's so much, I guess, still hidden, right? And you know, LGBT matters are often it's not visible necessarily who is or who isn't gay, and therefore actually we sort of assume a huge amount. I think there was a huge set of adverts done around the 15%, I think it's called, at the Paralympics. You know, that 15% of the world's population have a disability, and many of those are hidden. And I think, you know, there's just that point of raising awareness, raising the role models, bringing that perspective to the table, and that's the point where we just need to continue telling stories, I would say, in terms of educating people.
I agree with you. Matt, have we got any good questions in?
Yeah, we've got a few good questions. So yeah, one here from Kevin, who says that, Chris, you mentioned supporting younger LGBT professionals in the workplace. Now you are older and in a position to support them and be a role model. But what practical things do you do in order to be a supportive colleague and an ally? Any tips on that?
Yeah, I guess so. What do I try and do? I mean, a bit like Claire said earlier on, right? There is a certain point about being very visible. So, you know, internal profiles, you know, footers or what have you, really making sure that you are visible. I think if your company or organization has a mentoring network, then being, you know, very visible to say that you're an LGBT mentor to that. And I have mentored people actually around the world through sort of just being visible and being out there. And I think it's being there, you know, there is a point about being there for people, regularly checking in. I think there is a point about being a mentor and an ally, not just of waiting for somebody to get in touch, but probably, you know, pushing yourself out to contact them and just checking that they're all right, or thinking 2 steps ahead, recognizing they may be starting a new project or recognizing that they're going for a promotion point, and sort of just, you know, knowing them, I suppose, and thinking through what they might be going through at that moment in time, and being there to listen, I guess. But there is a point where you get to a level, and I think actually it's your duty. You know, you can't hide anymore, and you almost have to over-index, perhaps the visibility, I would say, in order to demonstrate to people that you're open and you're available for a chat. And going to events, I mean, back in the day when we did go to events, right, it's turning up. And it's turning up at, you know, the drinks party or what have you that is there, and showing that as a senior leader you care about it. It's always easy to go, oh, it's the next generation, they're having fun. But I do think it's really important for those events to turn up and spend time demonstrating that you're there to support people.
That's great. Thanks, Chris. Another question for you. It's a fairly long one, so I'm going to paraphrase it. I hope I get the spirit of this right, but feel free, whoever asked this, to let me know if I didn't. It's one of the many Claire in the room, Claire, so we're not sure who it is. But this individual grew up in South Africa at the same time, around about the same time as you, Chris, and also has some friends in the US, and really felt that South Africa and the US was a more kind of accepting environment back at that time, possibly still so today, reading between the lines. Do you think that you know, the UK had and has an issue with stigma around the acceptability of homosexuality, even though perhaps the law prevents or tries to kind of police that mindset, perhaps, and perhaps was a bit more progressive in the UK than in other places? do we rest on our laurels a little bit in the UK and think, well, you know, things were better here than they were elsewhere?
I think on the last point, I think the UK has a problem of thinking things are better there than they are elsewhere. I would say generally, right? I think that comes back to you know, having spent time overseas and worked a lot internationally. I think the UK has actually a significant problem of thinking things are better in the UK and better than anywhere else. That's probably true. Are we better or worse? I would say that there is something in that, in terms of probably a couple of thoughts on it. One, I would say, you know, it's very easy now, having moved from Northumberland to Manchester, for me to be, you know, have a very, I'll say, gay lifestyle, right? It is easy, and my sense is, yes, if you were in outside of some of those big cities, then I would say the UK is probably a hard place for many people to be gay, even today. So I would say there is still that perspective that's there. And also, if I look, my husband's Spanish, and if I look at actually Spain, I would say on all matters of diversity is a really interesting country, because I would say, despite its history in the 20th century, you know, its approach to diversity is probably more advanced. And you know, my mother-in-law, you know, she would comment on other people and sort of, you know, just almost accept that, well, why aren't they getting married? Of course they can get married if they get, you know, sort of almost over-indexing that as a Catholic country, and that's gone through sort of a very turbulent 20th century. I would say that Spain is a country I sit there and just go, wow, that the level of inclusion, I'd say, over there is possibly greater than in the UK.
Great, thanks for that. Another question here around sort of the practicalities of proliferating a message around LGBT equality in the workplace, where Irving asks that you know, any ideas around sort of this challenge that sometimes priorities that are set at the top can get perhaps lost when it gets to middle managers who have maybe some more near-term priorities around, you know, profits or perhaps bonuses sometimes, and perhaps don't see the kind of applicability or relevance of that equality drive from the top. Does that resonate at all in any of the organisations you've been in, or perhaps that you've consulted in at all, or is that not familiar to you?
I don't think, I'd say it's not familiar in the organisations I have worked in, and absolutely, you know, where I am right now, the founder and chief exec would say it's people first, client second, profit third, right? That's the point. And I think in anybody who works in professional services, you know that ultimately what you've got at the end of the day are your people. I think there is, you know, it's a hard one. It does need to come from the top. I think people need to really drive it. They need to be seen to be rewarding those people who are delivering. I think on the people agenda, it is hard that often profit or sales or revenue may be seen to trump that. But I think it's being really alert to understanding who are good people managers. At the end of the day, we're seeing, you know, it really clearly labour shortages right now, the war for talent, the fight for talent. People just, you know, if they're not being treated right, will move. And I think when you're looking today, I know full well, because I've seen it when it hasn't been the case. People, you know, when they can be themselves, when they don't have to hide themselves, they can be so much more productive. They can sort of bring themselves to work and just get on with the job. They're not worried about anything else. So, you know, my sense is actually most firms today, or certainly the ones that I'm working with, would put people matters absolutely on the table as one of the things they're managing their leaders on. And if they're not, my sense is they've probably got some longer term issues rather than just a quarter's profit.
So we're really making sure we broaden that definition of what constitutes a good manager, and managing that. That's great advice. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah.
Also a question here from Amy. Have you noticed the difference in attitudes from 10 years ago to today? And if so, how big of a difference is it?
an interesting one, because have I just got older, and am I seeing it from a different perspective, right? Whether it's your seniority or your age. What I see is much more refreshing, I think, is actually the people coming into the workplace. There's people graduating from university and all the rest of it. Actually, they're not doing what I had to do 20 years ago and hide themselves or pretend that they're somebody else. A huge amount of them actually are going, no, I know who I am. Their peers, that community, I would say young people today are much more accepting and have huge amount of diverse views. And actually, when people get into the workplace, they're not going to go back into the closet, which perhaps I did, or I felt I did, and perhaps many of others did, until they got themselves established. I would say that's probably the biggest change that I'm seeing. And then obviously the amount of representation, which continues to grow at all levels. And I think that's a great thing. So there's huge amount of role models. There's still some areas, perhaps in some areas of sport, where there aren't enough. But I would say across the board, we're now starting to see in all sorts of walks of lives, LGBT people, be visible, and see that representation. And I think that's only a good thing, and long may it continue.
Great. Just one last question. I'm going to amalgamate a few along a similar line, so hopefully this will do them justice if you sent me this one. But you reflected a little bit on kind of your how your kind of gay experience was woven through your career and life earlier on. If you could kind of go back and give yourself some advice back then, is there anything that you would give or say, or did it all work out all right in the end without it?
It worked out all right in the end. I guess like many people, I could have probably just go, don't worry so much, it'll be fine, people will be fine. I think that's the key point that I could have told myself a lot more. Don't hide yourself, just be who you are. I think that's the key point, right? It was a different era, it was all sorts of different circumstances, but I think there was probably that sense of rejection that I had for too long, or that fear of rejection, probably not the sense of rejection. And I think that would be the biggest thing I would tell myself. Actually, it will be fine. And to be fair, if the people, those that reject you, aren't friends or aren't people that you want to be around, so actually life's too short to be pretending to be somebody else for people who don't really care about you. So actually just that's probably what I would tell myself now.
That's great to hear. I think it's easy, isn't it, to sort of judge ourselves a little harshly sometimes looking back, and we forget that we do what we do back then to keep ourselves safe. And sometimes it's about rejection in terms of sort of friends, but as you highlighted in your story, sometimes it's a really very kind of real and sort of stark threat to your career and getting on in life, isn't it? So thanks so much, Chris. I'm going to hand back to Claire to talk about our breakout rooms.
Chris, did you find that coming from a small town that was sort of very beautiful and idyllic contributed to this feeling of wanting to stay in the closet, or did you think, get me out, get me to a big city, or what? How did it contribute?
It's a good question. It certainly probably contributed to get me out, to get me to a big city, get me away, right? There was very clear that I did not want to spend, the world's a big place and I wanted to get out and see it. But I do think there is something in those smaller locations where, you get the sense where everybody knows each other and knows what's going on and each other's business, etc. Even if it wasn't a tiny place, that also then says, well, if I come out, then it's these people and these friends of my family and right. You sort of it was that smaller place. But I certainly it perhaps spurred me on to be really clear in terms of getting out and seeing the world.
Yeah. Okay, brilliant. Right. Thank you so much, Chris. This was awesome.